For the last years, we have had different members of our congregation come forward and offer readings on Yom Kippur. We're going to continue a version of that this year. We're not having multiple people come up, just two. Two that I chose that share two important bonds. One, in the last year, they both lost their fathers. And two, both of their fathers were survivors of the Holocaust. And I've asked them to grace us today on our Bima and to share a little bit about their father's story and legacy and how it has galvanized them and this service dedicated to memory. I'd like to begin by inviting forward Dr. Sharon Fried, who will talk about her dad and my friend, Heshi Zelovic. Feel free to push this back if it's easier for you.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Sharon Fried, and I've been a proud member of Temple Emanu-El for more than 35 years. My husband's family for 5 generations. This year's my first year saying Yizkor. My father, Heshi Zelovic, passed away on November 11, 2020 from COVID at age 93. He was a survivor of the Shoah, and I hope to tell you a little bit of his life. My father was the 7th of 8 children and grew up in an Orthodox family in Munkacs, then part of Hungary. His childhood was peaceful and filled with daily cheder at 6 a.m. and again after he went to secular school, went back to cheder, and he helped out with the family's horse-drawn carriage company. After the onset of World War II, their happy home life was changed forever. 3 siblings were sent to labor brigades or were already in Palestine. The rest of the family were sent to Auschwitz in cattle cars. He remembered being hit on the head with a stick by the infamous Joseph Mengele when he tried to remain with his father during the separation at the selection process after they emerged from the cattle cars. His parents, oldest sister, and niece were immediately sent to the crematoria. My father and 3 siblings were assigned to work details and were sent to various camps for forced labor. Throughout these awful times, he and his brother, my Uncle Willie, never separated. After numerous near-death experiences and miraculous recoveries, they were liberated in April 1945. My father always attributed his survival to 2 things. 1, his faith in God and our traditions which sustained him, and 2, the presence of his brother and their support for each other at the most difficult times. At the time he was liberated, he was 17 years old and weighed 65 pounds. Following his recovery and a trip back to his hometown, only to find their possessions and business confiscated, he and my uncle joined a youth transport to London along with 1,000 young Jewish refugees. He met my mother at a community Hanukkah party. They were married in 1951 and emigrated to the Bronx in 1952, where I was born, and where they began 69 years of happy marriage. Miraculously, despite the previous difficult periods he had endured, he built a successful life in various occupations. Following stints as a pocketbook maker, driver, and sock salesman, he built his own business as a wholesale jewelry salesman. As for the rest of the family, luckily 7 out of 8 of his siblings survived and established large families in Israel, England, and Brazil. He always maintained his Jewish traditions, and he was so proud of his 4 granddaughters, especially when they shared their Judaic studies with him. My father was thrilled to get to know his 2 great-granddaughters, Sadie and Olivia, after his move back to our area from Florida 5 years ago. Our family was recently blessed with the arrival 2 weeks ago of Zachary Hirsch, named after my father Hershey and Uncle Willie. I deeply miss my father, but know he'd be so excited by this joyous arrival who bears his name. Heshi Zelovic's courage, strength, and perseverance and love of Judaism were an inspiration to all those who witnessed his ultimately successful life journey. We miss him.
Thank you, Sharon. I now would like to call forward Debbie Finkel, who just a few weeks ago laid her father Abe Paris to his eternal rest. And she is going to share some thoughts today about her beloved dad.
My name is Debbie Paris Finkel. This holiday season is very difficult for me because my father was laid to rest 2 weeks ago, with Shiva ending on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. Both of my parents were Polish Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. My life was shaped by two loving parents who provided me with a beautiful childhood and upbringing. But there were also undertones of the unimaginable trauma they experienced during the war. My father was born Abraham Parzynczewski, one of 6 children in his family, in Ozorkov, Poland, a small, idyllic town outside of Łódź, Poland's second largest city, where my mother was born. My father loved Ozorkov and spoke fondly of his happy childhood. This, of course, all ended on September 1st, 1939, when my father was 17 years old. The Nazis invaded Poland on that date, and their hatred of the Jewish people manifested itself quickly. My father's schoolroom education ended, and his real-world education began. The Nazis blew up Ozorkov's synagogue, where my father was bar mitzvahed, and forced my father, together with other Jews, to clean away the debris, thereby erasing its existence. Soon after, all the town's Jewish boys my father's age were forced to report for slave labor to a destination unknown to them. His mother packed extra food for him and told him it might be a long journey, so she gathered what she could. He never saw her again. Neither did he ever again see his father and 4 of his siblings. In fact, he never was able to find out when, where, or how his mother and 2 of his siblings were murdered. The next 6 years were filled with atrocities, starvation, beatings, hard labor, and unimaginable fear. My father was transferred to and from several slave labor camps before being sent to Buchenwald toward the end of the war. The Nazis took away his name and he became a number. My father ultimately was put on a so-called death march from Buchenwald to Theresienstadt at the end of the war. 2/3 of the Jews died on this forced march. My father, a living skeleton, was part of the lucky 1/3 who survived. He spent all the war years together with his first cousin, Sam Holtzman, and on that final march, Sam was sick with tuberculosis and could not go any further. My father would not leave him to die. He carried his cousin to the end. They were both liberated 6 weeks later from Theresienstadt. My father eventually returned to Ozorkov and the nearby large city of Łódź and waited each day to see if any one of his family members would return. They did not. He was alone. He met my mother, another Holocaust survivor, in Łódź after the war, and they eventually fled Poland, spending 3 years in a displaced persons camp in Austria, one of many set up in Europe by the Allies for stateless Jews waiting for permission to emigrate. Despite their immense grief, my parents looked to the future. They started with nothing. They had to learn a new language. My father learned a new trade. They had 3 more children, and life started anew. My father and Sam, the cousin that he carried on the death march, eventually became business partners and opened Holtzman and Paris Meat and Poultry in Borough Park, Brooklyn. This business is still open, and up until COVID, my father worked in the store. During COVID, he continued to work from home, doing the bookkeeping and the paperwork for the store. He was still working until 2 months ago. My dad was an incredible man. He and my mother survived the unthinkable and then built a tremendous life together. Through hard work, determination, and an unbreakable will, my father achieved the American dream: business success, home ownership, and educated and successful children. He was blessed to have 4 children, 8 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren. My father's greatest gift to his family is a legacy of loving kindness, an iron spirit, and a strong Jewish foundation. I hold a candle now, and I strive to instill in my own children my parents' ethics and values. L'dor vador.
Thank you, Debbie. And thank you, Sharon and Debbie, for honoring your fathers and your families in such a meaningful, beautiful way. Jonathan Ornstein, a dear friend of mine, is the CEO of the Krakow JCC. And he has, in his long list of accomplishments, a new accomplishment that he can proudly claim. He invented a new holiday. Like Hallmark, it's a new holiday that he came up with, and it's a day that he wants to make internationally recognized on every calendar, in every country, for every human being. I have been blessed and fortunate to be put on the committee for this new holiday that Jonathan has ideated. Jonathan explains, we have a day called Yom HaShoah, which commemorated the day of the Holocaust in Israel, a day that was chosen because it was the day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It's a day of immense sadness. We remember 6 million Jews who were murdered. And we have a day called Holocaust Remembrance Day that's always observed on January 27th, because that is the day in which Auschwitz and Birkenau were liberated. It's a day that's dedicated to all the people who we lost, to the horrors, to the families that were separated, and to the brave men and women who came and offered the liberation. But what about a day for people like Heshi and Abe of blessed memory? What about a day for people who had survived the unthinkable, who had lived through the Shoah, and somehow or another managed to find strength, courage, resolve, determination, and to begin again? Like you, my life was shaped with a heavy dose of Judaism, and like you, Holocaust survivors had a big role in shaping my Jewish identity. One of my first substitute teachers as a young boy in day school was Mary Wygotsky, a survivor of Auschwitz. And I remember going to shul as a little boy, the same way that Elias not so long ago was a little boy, or now I see Eliza Ruberg as a little girl coming to shul and being loved and adored by some of our older congregants. When I was a little boy, I remember the older congregants always reaching out their hands to give me candy. And there, on their arms, I would see the numbers. I would ask my dad when I got home, how come Mr. Schwartz has numbers on his arm? My dad would say, you should never know about those numbers. But what I came to realize in time, what I grew to understand, was that Mr. Schwartz, Mr. Paris, Mr. Zelovic, Mr. and Mrs. Tauber, Mr. and Mrs. Niederman, and the list can go on, of people in this community and around our world who had the strength, the resolve, and the faith to continue to live. Do you know how hard it is today to start a business? You know how hard it is today to go buy a house without help from a parent? You know how hard it is today to get a loan from a bank? Could you imagine coming to this country where you don't have one living relative? You don't have 2 nickels to your name. Your faith, your history, your DNA has just been wiped out. And yet these men and women came and they found a reason to believe. They started working and they pushed themselves to the max, and they made not only a difference, they made a name for themselves, they made a family, they started a career, a business. To think of the courage it took to do that, the strength it took to do that, and to think how they had that resolve to carry forward is worthy of recognition. It's right that we have a day called Yom HaShoah. It's right that we have a day called Holocaust Remembrance Day. But I think Jonathan is right that we should continue to follow a day on June 24th, named after one particular survivor, Marian Tursky, and we should dedicate that day to Holocaust survivors. A day that's not about death, a day that's not about liberation, a day that's not about barracks and about gas chambers, a day about strength, courage, and the ability to be indefatigable in our pursuit of that which is good and right. Marian Tursky, who lived his whole life in Poland, a survivor of the Shoah, he was the one who came up with the line that said, before there is a final solution, there's a first solution, a second solution, a third solution, and a fourth solution. And we must always be alert when we see those first, second, and third solutions, so that there is never a final solution. These survivors not only thrived in their world, they dedicated their lives to the memories of those who predeceased them. And the truth is, Eliza Ruberg, who's all of 2.5 years old, Elias Kirshner, who's all of 14 years old, and Evie Kirshner, all of 17 years old, they're really not going to know in depth these survivors, because the liberation of Auschwitz happened so long ago that there are very few that are left in our world today. And when we memorialize Abe and Heshi, what we're really memorializing beyond their individual deaths is the death of a generation of survivors of the Shoah. And it is incumbent upon our generation to do two important things. One, to honor our survivors, because they are more than survivors, they were thrivers. And we have a duty and a responsibility to honor the way in which they lived through circumstances that none of us could ever have dreamt of. And secondly, we have a responsibility to take the lessons of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and to make sure they do not lose a moment of their potency just because we start to lose the generation of survivors in our midst. That falls on us. That falls on the responsibility of children and grandchildren. And we rose to that challenge today when Sharon stood up here bravely on our bima in her first Yizkor to talk about her father and talk about his memory. We rose to that challenge today when Debbie stood bravely on this bima, still in the throes of mourning, to talk about her father and the way he lived and the dignity and grace he gave to others in the way in which he lived. That is the greatest testament to their life, to their survivorship, and to their memory. As we begin this Yizkor of 5782, we dedicate it to survivors in our midst. We dedicate it to those who have survived the Shoah. And while there are fewer of them in our midst, they will always live strongly in our hearts. As we begin this service of Yizkor, dedicated to the memory of all of those that we think about and those survivors of the Shoah, I would like to call forward Charlie and Robert Hammer, members of our synagogue. The Hammer family lost their mother this past year. She also survived the unthinkable, but through a different lens. She was in Germany. The life of the German Jew and the life of the Polish Jew was radically different, although still hell for both. And they were able to procure a Holocaust Torah, and they have given it to our temple that sat in our shul, in our Aron Kodesh, for the last 10 years at least. And to honor their mom and to honor their memory, we like to ask them to hold this Torah as we say Yizkor together. Cantor Singer will come forward, page 573. We rise. So Robert, I'm going to give you this. Yeah, I'd like you to open the ark. Stand right next to it. It's not light. It's very light.
אני מאמין. אני מאמין, אני מאמין, באמונה שלמה, בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח אני מאמין, ואף על פי שיתממיה, עם כל זה אני מאמין, אני מאמין, אני מאמין, אני מאמין, באמונה שלמה, בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח אני